Hello my friends, I hope you're having a lovely day, and in today's video we're going to take a look at Dragon Quest XI and Dragon Quest in general because the sales data for the United States came in for September 2019, and unfortunately Dragon Quest XI did not make it into the top 20 software overall. Now Dragon Quest XI did come out late in September, but there are other games on this chart that came out late in September and managed to place in the top 20. Also, we've seen numerous games do that throughout the years. They release very late in the month and still manage to secure a spot in the top 20. Dragon Quest XI was not one of them. If you look at the Switch overall charts, Dragon Quest XI has debuted at number 7. It was beaten out by Link's Awakening, Mario Kart 8, Smash Bros., Spyro Reignited Trilogy, Breath of the Wild, and Super Mario Maker 2. So, first-party heavy hitters, but all of them have been out for quite a long amount of time, and there is a third-party game in there as well, but still. The 7th place debut isn't exactly encouraging for a boom in sales for the Dragon Quest franchise. Now, I do want to point out that NPD does not track eShop sales, so it is possible that on the eShop Dragon Quest XI has done very well. We don't get actual sales data from either of these charts, but since we know it's lower than 20 in the overall charts on NPD, we know it didn't really have a great debut. And I don't know, retail charts are usually an indicator of how well something is doing digitally as well, so I can't imagine like it's completely lopsided and a ton of people went eShop and didn't go retail. So it seems like the debut for Dragon Quest XI just hasn't gone all that well, despite the many strong efforts from Square-Enix and Nintendo together. So I thought I'd talk a bit about how the Dragon Quest franchise just can't seem to find its footing outside of Japan. The Dragon Quest franchise has been going on since 1986, and it is huge in Japan. When it releases in Japan, it is a major deal. Each mainline installment brings out millions of customers to the streets to buy the standard edition and the collector's edition and the special edition, all that stuff. Millions of copies moved within the first month. It's considered a holiday, pretty much, and they actually ended up moving Dragon Quest launch days to the weekend, because when it used to be on the weekdays, too many people would skip out on school and work to play the game and call in with Dragon Quest sickness. So they moved it to the weekend to avoid that issue. So yeah, major deal in Japan. Outside of Japan, no, just doesn't seem to happen. And there are a few reasons why I think that might be, and I honestly don't know if Square-Enix can turn things around. To explain the biggest reason, I have to stop and take a look at the Final Fantasy franchise, which again is another long-running RPG franchise and has a huge fan base in Japan. And for a number of years, the titles came out outside of Japan, and they did okay, but it was pretty much like Dragon Quest. They didn't really get the same amount of attention that they did in Japan. But that all changed when Final Fantasy VII came out. It can't be understated just how important Final Fantasy VII was to the entire Final Fantasy franchise. That was a major moment for the Final Fantasy series, and it really cemented the franchise outside of Japan. And it had a lot to do with the jump in visuals and how that was marketed. Gamers were used to 16-bit consoles, and then we had the PlayStation come out with Final Fantasy VII, and in the marketing, they were showing off the cutscenes for that game. And at that time, the cutscenes were unbelievable. They were absolutely mind-blowing. And almost every single commercial was showing the cutscenes for the game. And back in that time, people were like, oh my god, how is this even possible? This is mind-blowing. Like I said, hadn't really seen anything like it. Especially if you were a console gamer, it was so far above and beyond what we were used to. And yes, it may not be interactive cutscenes or interactive gameplay or anything like that, but, cutscenes like that were a big deal were becoming a big deal for the game industry, because it was like an event, something to sit down and watch and see, and further the story in a game in a way that had never been done before with consoles. So it was exciting, and it was just such a big moment that a lot of people who A, had no interest in RPGs, B, had no interest in Final Fantasy, C, didn't even know what Final Fantasy was, saw these commercials or the print ads or whatever, and were like, oh my god, I cannot miss out on this, and they had to get that game. They jumped in on it, and it brought in millions upon millions of people who have never played Final Fantasy games. And sure, some of those people have dropped off in the years, that's very true, but that is the installment in the franchise that brought all those people in and just spread the name of Final Fantasy VII, or Final Fantasy in general. So even if people didn't play Final Fantasy VII, they were at least aware of the franchise, and when a new installment came out after that, they were considering taking a look at it or would follow up on information about it, because Final Fantasy had become a bigger name for video game players outside of Japan. Now, Dragon Quest never had that moment, and I think it's pretty much impossible for Dragon Quest to have that moment now, because we're so far beyond the days of moments where video games could really wow with visuals to that level anyway. Consoles get better and better, and they get more horsepower, and they can push more impressive visuals, but it's the law of diminishing returns. Things can only look so much better. Things can only look so much more real. Nowadays, the jump in visuals shows you a higher fidelity, and maybe things look a bit shinier and a little bit more impressive overall, and maybe there's more action going on screen, but it's not like the jump from 8 to 16-bit or 16 to 32-bit. That is something you could show to anyone, regardless of what they knew about video games, and they could say, wow, look at how much better that looked. And that just can't happen anymore. So there's no, for as shallow as it sounds, that jump in visuals was a huge pushing point for Final Fantasy VII, and Dragon Quest isn't going to have that opportunity. Sure, there's things like virtual reality nowadays, which isn't really new anymore, but that's at least somewhat akin to the jump in visuals. It's certainly a new way to experience visuals in a game, but there's so many hurdles in between the player and the potential market when it comes to VR that it just won't have the same reach, so it's not the same thing. Plus, I don't think moving Dragon Quest to VR would really wow enough people for them to jump in and check out the franchise, so that opportunity that popped up for Final Fantasy VII and meant so much just can't be replicated for Dragon Quest. Another thing that I think might hold back the Dragon Quest franchise is just how similar of a vibe each installment has. The stories might be different and the characters might be different, but settings are very similar, and experience is very similar, and visuals are extremely similar, even though visuals have improved over the years. The art style is pretty much the same. We just have hardware that's capable of showing that art style in a better or higher fidelity way. Akira Toriyama, who did Dragon Quest, has done the art for, who has done Dragon Ball, has done the art for Dragon Quest, and you know that style when you see it. You see the in-game visuals and you recognize that style, and that's what a lot of, if not all the installments use. So it just gives everything a very similar feeling, and I don't know if that gets fans excited outside of Japan, because they see that and they're like, oh yeah, another Dragon Quest game, where again, I can turn to Final Fantasy, and they've certainly used some of the same artists for multiple installments, but when it comes to visual approach and setting, those have greatly changed between Final Fantasy games. There's some that are hyper-futuristic, and some that are more Renaissance, and some that really play up the fantasy style of things. So there's, different approaches with each one, but Dragon Quest feels like Dragon Quest every single time. I've also heard people say that as far as Dragon Quest goes, it is a very by-the-books, straightforward RPG. Things don't really change up between installments. It's just a very traditional RPG experience, and it seems like in Japan, that's very important to the franchise's success, and fans don't want to see the game stray too far from what previous installments have done. And there have been some tweaks and changes throughout the years, but by and large, it's just a very straightforward traditional RPG, and that's what makes it endearing to the fans who have been with it since day one, or at least been with it since early on. But again, outside of Japan, that just kind of leaves people feeling uninterested. They see the trailers for the latest games and they're like, there's not really anything in there in the way of bells and whistles, or not really doing anything new, or not really doing anything that countless other RPGs haven't done, and done with some unique twists of their own. So why would I take the time to put into Dragon Quest XI? Like, I want to play an RPG experience that gives me something new and different and tries some unique things, and Dragon Quest just doesn't seem like the type of franchise to do that. It's rooted in its history, and again, that's a plus for Japan, but a detriment outside of Japan. Now, I want to point out that I'm mentioning these things not as a negative personally. I do not see them as a negative. I am not someone who has played all the Dragon Quest games, but I have played a number of them. I am playing through Dragon Quest XI right now, and I really do enjoy them. There's something about that quaint, safe nature about Dragon Quest games that I really appreciate, and I also appreciate the history of the franchise. Like, even though I haven't played them all and the franchise isn't big outside of Japan, when a new installment does come here, I feel like it's something important. I feel like it's something notable. I'm like, it's really cool to see this franchise continuing on. So I'm viewing it a little bit differently, and I enjoy that experience. But again, I'm not a big RPG player, so I'm not as well versed in all the RPGs that are out there, at least when it comes to what they actually give you throughout the experience. I might know them by name, but I haven't played them. So maybe if I played more RPGs, I would be bored by Dragon Quest. I don't know. I just want to stress that personally, I do not feel the same way about the franchise as it seems like a majority of people outside of Japan do. So what would it take for Dragon Quest to have its moment outside of Japan? I'm sure Square-Enix has considered what to do, and they just haven't been able to come up with something, and I don't blame them, because it's a conundrum. What do you do? I guess you could really try and spice up gameplay and add in some new things in there and give the visuals a complete overhaul and go with a brand new art style and all that stuff. But the problem there is you risk alienating your major fan base in Japan. If you're gonna take the series and really do something different with it and consider it a main installment in the Dragon Quest franchise, then you risk losing a lot of those fans. Now the question is, are you gonna have a hit outside of Japan to make up for that lost audience and potentially grow it in Europe and North America and reach even more people overall, even when counting the lost fans in Japan? I don't know. That's a hell of a risk to take. I think that's why they do things with spin-offs, to try and reach an audience and grow the franchise that way. They do spin-off titles to try and bring people into the Dragon Quest brand and be like, hey, here's Dragon Quest Builders, and maybe people will play that and like that and be like, maybe I should check out this Dragon Quest franchise and, move over to the next main installment. I'm sure they were hoping that the inclusion of Hero and Smash Brothers would do some of that too, and I'm sure it has. I'm sure there are people who are interested in checking out Dragon Quest traditionally now that they've seen Hero and Smash Brothers, but that's going to take time, and it's not going to be millions of people, but it could happen. But yeah, I honestly don't know what would be the earth-shattering movement they could make where they wouldn't lose fans in Japan and somehow grow the series outside of Japan. Again, I think the time for that kind of seismic shift has come and gone, and they can just gradually do what they're doing now, pick away and try new things with spin-offs and see if something clicks in a big enough way to woo people over. So that's my thoughts on Dragon Quest's success in Japan and lack of success out of Japan, and I just want to point out, which I'm sure you know, I am in no way an expert of Dragon Quest, but I've been thinking a lot about the series lately, especially with Dragon Quest XI finally coming to the Switch, and just looking at its success and how the series is treated around the world. So I thought it'd make for an interesting video. I'd love to hear from you guys and hear what you think Square Enix could do to push the series' success worldwide. And I also would love to hear why you haven't checked out the franchise and don't have any plans on getting Dragon Quest XI. Perhaps you got it on another system already. Perhaps you prefer other RPGs, just whatever it is. I would like to know what has kept you away from Dragon Quest XI, or perhaps Dragon Quest in general. So hit up the comments and let me know. But as for today, that is it. Thanks for watching, liking, subscribing, and commenting. It's very much appreciated. Also, a huge thank you to our Patreon gang. Thank you so much for supporting me on Patreon. I greatly appreciate it. It helps me do everything that I do. Videos like this, the site in general, Twitter, podcast, all that good stuff. Thank you so much. If you want to learn more about the Patreon, which is just $1, you can check out the link in the description below. But that's it for today. I'll be back tomorrow with something. I don't know what it will be. But until then, have a lovely day and a lovely evening. And I'll see you in a few short hours.